Hey everyone, how's it going? So to start this video, I have a little question I want you to think about. If you knew that the town or city you lived in would possibly be invaded, the people living there killed en masse, what would you do? Furthermore, what if your city or town didn't have the equipment necessary to really defend itself? Again, what would you do? Well, New Zealand back in early 1940 was faced with this conundrum. With the British Empire, as New Zealand was a British colony, engaged in a war against Nazi Germany and the threat of Japanese aggression in the Pacific growing by the day, the government of New Zealand decided that they needed to do something, anything at all, to increase their defensive capabilities. Furthermore, with it becoming increasingly unlikely that Britain or other major powers in general would ship them any weaponry, whether that be due to participation in active conflict or country neutrality, it was determined that something had to be done domestically with what little they had. For this task, Bob Semple and E.J. Schofield stepped forward to try and help. Their resulting creations have been the subject of some pretty intense ridicule and mockery. We'll start with the more ridiculed of the two in Semple's creation, with what is known as the Bob Semple Tank. Under the direction and prodding of then Minister of Public Works, Bob Semple, production of a makeshift tank prototype began sometime in early to mid-1940. Tasked to handle the construction was T.G. Beck and the Public Works Department, using workshops located in Temuka. Semple had apparently been influenced and impressed by early tank conversions done by the United States in the early 1930s, where tractors were converted to makeshift rudimentary tanks. These tanks would later be sold to smaller countries like Afghanistan. A Caterpillar D8 tractor was used as the base, and the overall design envisioned a turret using a 37mm cannon and 5 additional Bren machine guns making out the armaments. However, a cannon like this could not be obtained at the moment, so an additional machine gun was used as the turret instead. The tank's armor consisted of both 8mm thick armor plating and 12.7mm thick corrugated plates, a thicker version of what you see on metal rooftops. It's the usage of the corrugated plate that gives the tank its iconic, rather shoddy appearance. And apparently, in testing, this armor was good enough to stop machine gun fire and some anti-tank rifle fire, but it is unlikely that it would have stopped much more than that. So it shouldn't be surprising to learn that this visual monstrosity didn't perform too well in testing. Since it used a tractor as a base and several tons of metal were just bolted on the top of a tractor, the tank was both slow and unwieldy, moving at around 8 miles an hour max, and having to stop moving altogether just to change gears. It was also apparently very difficult to shoot from one of the many machine gun ports, as both the shape of the design and the vibrations caused by the tractor made aiming a chore. Additionally, apparently, a mattress had to be placed on top of the engine so a gunner could actually use one of the machine gun ports. Eventually, the top turret was removed as being rather redundant and pointless without some kind of proper tank cannon, which did reduce the weight a little bit to somewhere around 18 to 20 tons, but also slightly reduced the firepower as a trade-off. By October 1941, when testing on the tank was still ongoing, New Zealand finally began receiving British-made Valentine tanks. Couple this with the fact that New Zealand could produce Bren gun carriers and had the infrastructure to do so when the Semple tank was designed, mind you, made it kinda pointless to continue testing on the Bob Semple tank. As a result, testing was cancelled and the 3 total prototypes that were made of this tank were later scrapped. The second tank, less iconic but still fascinating nonetheless, was the brainchild of A.E.J. Schofield, who worked for the General Motors in Wellington. His design, instead of using a tractor as the base, was to use a commercially available Chevrolet truck chassis and combine that with the suspension of one of the universal Bren gun carriers. The resulting design created a rather strange amalgamation that was simultaneously an armored truck and a tank. The tank could use either the rubber truck tires or the tank treads for movement. This, combined with the relatively low weight of around 5,000 kilograms, made it so that it could travel over 25 miles an hour on the treads and about 45 miles an hour on the tires. The tank was armored with about 8mm thick plating provided by the New Zealand Railways, and the armaments consisted of initially 2 Besa machine guns. However, after initial government trials, a 2-pounder tank cannon was somehow found and installed as the turret, making the armament 1 cannon and 1 machine gun. Now, despite the fact that the design concept was not completely without merit in that it could hypothetically be this sort of high-mobility hybrid light tank, the Schofield tank was met with the same fate in the end as the Bob Semple tank. It would eventually be scrapped after being sent over to England for testing and evaluation in 1943. After the evaluation, it was advised that the project should be stopped, and coupled with the fact that New Zealand was now in possession of more proper weaponry, the project was halted, and sometime after the war was over, the Schofield was also scrapped. Now, as stated before, both of these tanks, the Bob Semple one in particular, have been subject to significant ridicule both in their day and now. After the Bob Semple tank participated in a parade in 1941, it was the subject of much media ridicule, which we can see in some political cartoons from the time mocking the tank and Bob Semple himself. Today, the Bob Semple tank in particular frequently appears on Worst Tanks Ever list for being slow, clunky, underpowered, and kind of comical looking. Oddly enough, the Schofield tank has avoided a good deal of criticism and mocking today, probably because it does look more like a standard tank apart from the wheels. Regardless of all this mocking, I do have to ask, do these tanks deserve all the criticism and mocking they receive today? I mean, sure, they likely wouldn't have been very effective and did look quite comical, but I think a lot of people are missing the point of these tanks and what they represent. These tanks don't represent a serious attempt by a major power to build a new, strong fighting vehicle. These tanks don't represent the best efforts of a major military power to innovate and expand its arsenal. What these tanks represent is a genuine effort of a country, and specifically just a few people, doing what they could with the resources they had to try and defend their country. They simply didn't have the resources other countries would have had, so they had to scrounge together what they could and try to make something that could be called a tank. In a time of great distress for New Zealand, with Britain at war and it looking increasingly likely that Japan would invade the Southeast Pacific, which they did, 2 people, Bob and EJ, decided to try and do something. Sure, what they ended up making was rather crude and comical looking, but it was still something. These 2 tanks kind of remind me of something else, the FP-45 Liberator. If you don't know what this is, the Liberator was a crude little pistol, designed to be completely bare bones and cheap to produce. Looking at it critically and without proper context, it is an objectively terrible pistol. However, in proper context, it's actually kind of impressive and maybe ingenious. It was designed by the US military to be dropped in occupied territory and acquired by resistance fighters, giving them something to use until they could get something better. That something better was intended to be the guns of a dead Axis soldier, of course. But in a way, that's how I kind of view the Bob Semple and Schofield tanks. They weren't going to be technologically impressive or wonderfully manufactured. They were going to be something New Zealand could potentially use, if needed, until something better came along. It just so happens that more proper tanks did come along, which rendered them useless. It's because of this that I don't think we can or really should compare the Bob Semple and Schofield tanks to their more practical and better-made contemporaries. Instead, they should be viewed as pieces exemplifying people standing tall in the face of adversity, doing whatever they could to help and protect their fellow countrymen. These tanks, born out of fear and desperation, should be viewed with admiration and respect, not for what they were, but for the courage it took to even try and make them. And it seems as though Bob Semple himself would agree with that, as he is quoted as saying in late 1941, "That tank was an honest-to-God effort to do something with the material at our disposal when raiders were at our back door. Instead of sitting down and moaning, we felt we ought to do something to manufacture weapons that would help and defend our country and our people." And on that quote, I think we'll end because I think it rather sums up how I view both the Bob Semple and Schofield tanks. So, as usual, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, you know, all the usual fun YouTube stuff. If you like this video, maybe check out some of my other videos that should be on the screen at some point, and I want to say thank you for actually watching the last video I made that somehow has hit 3,000 views at the time of me recording this audio. I'm not entirely sure how it hit 3,000 views, but that makes me a little happy nonetheless. But anyway, I hope you did like the video, and at the very least, if you didn't, I hope you learned something. So, alright, see ya.